Hi, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to introduce my teacher, my dear friend, a mentor in many ways when I needed mentoring as a confused young ophthalmologist of 26 when we first met in the Western Infirmary in Glasgow, where Gordon was primarily responsible for running that world-famous program of 7, 8, 9 months to teach students from all over the world. And I think it's safe to say that Gordon has at least one student, if not very many more, in virtually every country of this world. I remember I first met Gordon in 1986, but 10 years later, we met up in London. And I remember Gordon and me sitting out in Hyde Park on one of those chairs that you could hire. And he was so excited telling me about the new work that he was doing. At the end of a 20-minute long narrative, I told him, Gordon, I can't understand anything you're saying. So we were both going together to attend a lecture I was giving in Moorfields Hospital. So he said to me, Barjot, you are in a completely different world and I'm in a completely different world. I think Gordon's world is far more rewarding, far more compassionate, and far more giving to those children and human beings who are so much less fortunate than we are. I'm looking forward, as all of us are, to hearing about Gordon's work in CVI. And Gordon, it's again such a pleasure seeing you like this, and even more so, seeing you so unexpectedly. And we would all be delighted to hear what you're saying to us, teaching us again. I sit at your feet once more, 30 years after I first did, and we look forward to hearing your lecture.
Yes, Dr. Dutton, now you can take over the screen. Welcome to India.
Well, Virgil, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And thank you also for those first two talks, which provide a perfect entry into this one. My talk is entitled Cerebral Palsy, Identifying and Acting on the Visual Difficulties Caused by the Related Cerebral or Cortical Visual Impairments. These words can be used interchangeably. Cerebral visual impairment, or CVI, has been defined as a verifiable visual dysfunction which cannot be attributed to disorders of the anterior visual pathways or any potentially co-occurring or ocular impairment. And for over 10 years now, it has been considered a diagnosis integral with cerebral palsy, as it is known to affect around 50% of cases. The key premises for this talk is that child development is dependent upon learning, but no one can learn from what they cannot perceive. And our medical role for cerebral visual impairment, or CVI, stops at diagnosis. It then needs to be replaced by our teaching role. Parents are the key educators, and they need to be supported and trained in small and salient steps by everyone that professionally they encounter. So as professionals, we all need to understand the child's limitations as a profile to work within, and the child's abilities as a profile to make best use of, recognizing that learning requires access to information. It requires the cerebral, visual, and other impairments can impair this access. We need to recognize that. And this means that each specific impairment caused by cerebral visual impairment must be found, identified, and its limitations to access to information identified and always worked within. And in the context of the child's profile of abilities, these include their visual skills. We need to identify what they can do, not just what they can't do. We need to identify their hearing and their language skills along with our colleagues in team work. And of course, we need to identify their motor abilities, not just their disabilities, so that they can learn to make best use of their own worlds. And we need to identify their social skills and help that development too. So with this information, we can inform and teach the parents, that's all of us can teach the parents what can be seen and what cannot be seen. So that it cannot be learned from, and how to adapt to their child's world to enable their child to learn and to develop. So with CVI, what aspects of vision may be limited and need profiling? Following on from Niranjan's talk, my way of thinking is similar and is to consider the salient visual brain structures, starting, of course, with the primary visual cortex. That is where the imagery is formed. So for central visual function, we need to assess the functional binocular visual acuity, which can then be interpreted for the families and relatives and friends as the measured line and gap widths needed for all imagery at salient distances to easily access information. I've always provided a felt tip pen of that line width, telling the parents to go through all the child's books and make the eyes and the mouth and the nose visible when they weren't visible before, because we've just measured that they'd not been able to see them. And at what distance is eye contact gained and maintained so that one can always stay within that distance, because without it, you can't communicate. We need to think of the functional contrast sensitivity, which is the level of contrast needed to easily access information, not the limit, but the functioning limit. And what degree of contrast is needed to allow faces and facial expressions to be seen? Although not much is known about color, we need to find out what colors and color contrasts are best seen and discriminated. And then it moves on in the occipital cortex, which areas of the visual field, the peripheral vision, and the attentional visual field, which comes to the posterior parietal lobes, which can best give access to information. Are there lower visual field impairment present, hampering movement? And what needs to be done to cater for this? So which areas of the visual field and the visual attentional field give best access to the information? And then we move on to the middle temporal lobes, which weren't mentioned, but they are just in front of the occipital lobes, and that is the area responsible for seeing motion. And of course, our whole worlds are always moving. As we move through the world, everything else moves in the opposite direction. So is perception of movement limited by injury to this part of the brain? That is called dyskinetopsia. And if so, at what slower speeds can information, meaning anything to learn from that moves, communication, meaning the movements of the face and gestures, and mobility, as you move through, what moving hazards might there be to be seen? And then we need to think about the posterior parietal lobes. These map the world as has already been outlined. And they map the world so that we can search the world and so that we can move through the world using the picture in our minds, which is an emulation of the world outside through which we move in order to get our limbs to their destinations. So it's not just a motor problem, is it a visuomotor problem? Our worlds are created by our posterior parietal lobes in real time as a non-conscious 3D mental emulation of our surroundings that allows vision to guide our movements and to give the framework for the conscious visual scene created in the temporal lobes to be mapped both with respect to ourselves egocentrically and with respect to the world around us allocentrically. Now, this has been known since 1918, when Gordon Holmes studied 6 soldiers where shrapnel went through their brains from the First World War. And here is Sergeant K, who's got a bilateral lower visual field impairment from a parietal pathology and also was only able to see 1 or 2 things at once. And when he said about the world, he said, I could see the things I can see clearly, but my feet do not know where that step is. He had impaired visual guidance of movement or akinetopsia, and he could also see nothing that moved. So we need to recognize the resulting spectrum of Balint syndrome, which is the severe element, to the mild dorsal stream dysfunction. And with Sweta Philip, we've published a series of cases from India where the posterior parietal lobes are afflicted in each of these 4 pictures. The ring has been slightly moved, I'm afraid, but where you can see a focal injury to that area of the brain. But of course, remember, it's also commonly afflicted in cerebral palsy too. We've mentioned periventricular white matter disease. And in the periventricular areas is where this white matter is. This amazing work from 2016 shows a sighted control on the left with the dorsal stream, which anatomically is the SLF or the superior longitudinal fasciculus that I'm moving my arrow around, which takes the picture from the occipital lobes up into the posterior parietal lobes and then to the frontal lobes where we know what we are looking at. And then the ILF, the inferior longitudinal fasciculus, which takes the information to the temporal lobes and then up into the frontal lobes so that we can recognize things. And as you can see in the ocular blind, they have all these pathways. And therefore they use alternative ways of knowing and understanding their worlds because these pathways are redeployed. But in cerebral visual impairment, these are not, because they are much smaller, much thinner, far less can be seen. And this explains how only a small amount of stuff can be seen, or simultanagnosia. And fewer objects might be recognized if this bundle is afflicted. Often it isn't. Often it's only this one in cerebral palsy, and often this one can be intact, but sometimes it's not. So every child with cerebral visual impairment has their own independent, separate, unique pattern that needs to be profiled. So let's think of simultanagnostic vision. This picture was made for me by a lady who has it, and she said, I only look at the man and this is what I see. Not being able to give attention to the rest of the scene, singularity of Balint syndrome. So we need to think then, what are the limits to clutter and crowding? How much clutter needs to be removed, as in that terrible light room with all those lights on, when only one light is needed on the mother's face to make her exist as a singular entity in somebody who's got profound cerebral palsy, quadriplegic cerebral palsy. And so also how accurate is visual guidance of movement of the upper and lower limbs, recognizing that this is not just motor, it is visuomotor. And is this better in the upper visual fields, knowing that the lower visual fields are commonly restricted as well? Often reach is better there. So let's move on to recognition. We do this by comparing the incoming images from our eyes with our library of images inside our temporal lobes, as in this case with hydrocephalus afflicting both dorsal and ventral streams and occipital lobe. So here is a picture of the right temporal lobe, where the fusiform gyrus, where faces and roots are stored. Ever realized that you don't recognize somebody in a place that they're not supposed to be in? That's common because they're cross-filed together. So that recognizing, can faces be recognized even though the acuity is good enough? And again, at what distance? And in what degree of crowding? Because it could be a low acuity, or it could be due to a degree of crowding, meaning that only one can be seen. And do facial expressions have meaning? Again, at what distance and at what speed? Because it could be a speed issue. And at what degree of crowding? It could be a crowding issue, which is making this child appear to be autistic, appear not to have theory of mind, because we are judging them by our own vision, not theirs. And how good is route finding out and about and at home? And then thinking about the left temporal lobe, which sees geometric shape, how good are we, is the affected child at being able to see objects and shapes and even letters, recognizing that language and words are also interpolated further forwards in the left parietal cortex. So remember that like cerebral palsy, cerebral visual impairment is a lifelong journey within an alternative state of normality. And in this context, what models of thinking do we as professionals need? Behaviors in children with cerebral visual impairment can be adaptive when they compensate well. They can be reactive when they're overwhelmed and absent when they cannot see. So while parents need to understand and adapt and cater for their children's needs as well. So we need to always recognize this and work with this framework of understanding. So let's develop this theme with some examples. This picture by Lennox et al. Was one of the early and one very important paper on the lower visual field impairment in children with spastic diplegia who have periventricular white matter pathology, cupping of their optic discs due to transsynaptic retrograde degeneration, lower visual field impairment, which is subtle and may not have been detected unless it was really sought out. And that will come back to that shortly. So with lower visual field impairment, that table may not be seen. And so if it's moved, might be a problem. And then the adaptations to lower visual field impairment is when going downstairs, for those who can, they do it very carefully. They often slide their heel down the riser to be able to judge the height. They hang on to the banister. It might not just be motor. They might feel with their foot to check whether there is a step present or not because they don't see it well. They may lie on the floor upside down, watching the television in their upper visual fields as a very clever adaptation, not as an eccentricity. They may go down a slide head first to use their upper visual fields to see where they're going. They may push a plate further away in order to be able to find the food on it. And they may hold a book up in their upper visual field in order to get down to the next line, which might not have been visible. What about reactions to the lower visual field impairment? For those that are mobile, they may be very reluctant to jump off a bench, very reluctant to jump into a swimming pool because they jumped onto somebody's head they didn't see before. They may hate it when a table is moved because they've mapped it before and get very angry, understandably. They may hate going over floor boundaries because they don't know whether there's a step there or not. They may hate going over edges of pavements, tripping as they go. And ball games where there's a fast ball on the ground that's invisible are totally reprehensible. They make no sense whatsoever. And then there's the absence of behavior due to a lower visual field impairment. All those toys fell down, but once they've fallen into the blind field, they can't be found again, can they? And yet such a child, if they can stand, will play for ages with their toys looking up on the kitchen table. They may leave food on the plate. They may leave shoes on the ground. They may get very scuffed shoes. What adaptations to simultaneous agnostic vision? They may get very close to the television, if they're allowed to only see one or two things at once. They may sit behind somebody looking up in their upper field because they can't look at a face and listen at the same time because that is too much information to process. They may look away when having a conversation rather than looking at you in order to hear the sound. They may place a toy on a plain background and not a patterned one in order to find it. They may line toys up, not because they're autistic, but because they can find them again by one-dimensional search. The parents may have adapted to this by making a plain room, by having a clear floor, by having a compartmentalized plate so food doesn't overlap, by having a high shelves where they can store possessions in an intact upper visual field, by having search in one direction in these compartmentalized things in wardrobes, by having a book stand. I've been taught all of this by parents. They may react to simultaneous agnostic vision by only being able to light gaze, because that's competitive simultaneous agnosia. They probably can't see more than one thing at once. So that's a really useful clinical sign. They may look down at the floor because they can't look up because there's too much to see. They may hate being in traffic and be terrorized by it. Walking in crowds may be very frightening because they can't tell where people are in 3D space, and they may coil back in terror as people approach because they can't map them in 3D space, which is the flip side of impaired visual guidance of movement, impaired mapping of the movement of others, not knowing where they are, frightening. We can adapt to this, we can understand it. So quadriplegic children, as already been mentioned, often have marked posterior parietal pathology. And this boy, for the first time, looked around inside this tent. So the impact of being surrounded by a tent can be phenomenal for those that have profound simultaneous agnosia because their pathology of their parietal lobes extends further back into this mapping area. And this can have a major impact on language learning, because if you can only see one thing at once and you've got low speed of processing, then only what you are looking at or feeling is what you know of. So this boy, this 6-year-old boy, started to learn language for the very first time when he was given single items to handle and single words to label those items. It was we who were wrong. We need radio and not TV, child-centered communication about everything. Just think of the radio for cricket. It makes sense, but that's not normal language. But they need this radio language all the time. It's essential. Think about their behaviors to temporal lobe pathology. When it comes to being able to recognize faces, they may not do so. Find people, be able to route find, and be able to know objects and shapes. And so the classical clinical approach concerns threshold measurement. It concerns the key ophthalmic approaches of anatomical diagnosis, pathological diagnosis, neuro-ophthalmic classification, and an understanding of the visual brain that this brings. But this does not help the child, because we need to take this forwards in communication, as Niranjan just told us. So let's wait. Children can only learn from what they can perceive. They cannot learn from what they cannot see. That's obvious. So developmentally, there's an issue, and neither can you if you make this material almost invisible, which I have for you. It's exactly the same slide, but almost invisible. So the key needs of the child are visual and auditory, to be accessible, to be learning and teaching the developmental needs, their behavioral needs, their emotional and psychiatric needs. And this needs a team effort. Vision facilitates mobility, it facilitates access to information, it facilitates social communication, and children need to learn all these skills. 85% of their time is spent with their parents, even in mainstream school. So what do children with CVI need? To help them learn to develop optimally, to thrive and to succeed, their parents and their teachers to learn their theory of mind, their limitations and their strengths. But to what extent are we all self-referencing? To what extent do we not have the child's theory of mind? To what extent are we autistic unto the child? And how can we rectify this? By seeing through the child's eyes and helping others to do this too. So think about this. You might be interested now, if you have a camera, to photograph this just now off the screen. This is our simulation of simultanagnosia on our website, CVI Scotland. It shows that simultanagnosia gets worse under conditions of stress and conditions of crowding. And these are opportunities for to be able, with Sight Sim, which you can get by scanning these two things with your own iPhone if you want to. You can find Sight Sim to simulate acuity, that's my bell, and you can use this also to simulate acuity on peak vision, because Sight Sim works on computers. Peak vision is an app for your phone. So those are our books that we've published over the years, and I commend you our website, CVI Scotland, and the CVI Society website. And on CVI Scotland, if you want to have further lessons as paramedical professionals listening to this, you've got 51 talks from me, which you can find under lessons on CVI Scotland, each about 2 to 3 minutes long, which I hope you enjoy. Thank you. Here's a view of Scotland.
Wow, that was great, Dr. Gordon Dutton, and you helped us see the world through the eyes of a child who has CVI, and that's indeed a fantastic experience for all of us. I would request Dr. Firoz Mehta to give a vote of thanks to Dr. Dutton.
Gordon, you can hear me?
I can indeed, Firoz.
Yeah. Gordon, that was as brilliant as anything I've ever heard. And you have lost none of your teaching skills that I fathomed, I understood, and learned from you 30 plus years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, I met Gordon Dutton many, many moons ago, but I never found a better teacher than Gordon in my life in ophthalmology, which is now reaching its peak almost 35, 40 years later. But there was none better than Gordon that I have ever met. And it was a great pleasure to have learned again from him all these very interesting aspects that he has spent his life working in. But to make it a little interesting, I'll just diverse a little from what Barjor already has mentioned of Gordon, that Gordon's better half, also a consultant ophthalmologist, had Indian upbringing because she was a daughter of Scottish missionaries in the middle provinces of India. And she grew up in India and then went away to Scotland to become a doctor and an ophthalmologist, and later married Gordon Dutton. And therefore, Gordon spends quite some time visiting India because Kirsty needs to see her friends, and therefore Gordon is seen around. And I'm sure we people should make more use of Gordon's skills and teaching abilities when he comes around to India. Gordon, a lot of friends of ours from Bombay have wished both Kirsty and you lots of love.
Thank you.